Sounds good. Thank you there, Brother Seth. Okay. Good news for Christians who seek to establish their own righteousness. God's going to get you anyway. God's going to use you. God's going to use you in weird ways because you're seeking to establish your own righteousness. So it's going to be a great contrast between your silly self-righteousness and God's righteousness. Boy, we're going to learn a lot here as God's Aeonian purpose continues. Okay, good news for Christians who seek to establish their own righteousness. God's going to get you anyway. It's quite natural to want to be accepted in society, dear friend, and it would make sense and it would make sense to want to be accepted into the society of God, or shall we call it accepted into the family of God. Therefore, we all kind of know that God is righteous, and we all suspect that God wants righteousness out of us too, right? So it would make sense to find Christians, immature Christians, who so desperately want to be accepted that they seek to establish their own righteousness, even though they haven't got a clue as to what they are doing. You'll notice that even a 4 or 5-year-old child will try to establish their own righteousness. Is just a thing. The problem with the notions of establishing your own righteousness is this wicked little thing of condemning others who don't quite measure up to your standard of righteousness. You'll remember that we are scooting around the book of Romans trying to find places where the accomplishments or achievements of the cross are revealed or discussed. Today, let's hop over to chapter 10. Keep in mind that it seems Galatians is the first letter to come from the pen of Paul, and the letter to the Galatian saints was all about how to deal with the Judaizers who were harassing Paul's band of brothers, trying to get them all involved in works, law, appearances, and do's and don'ts. In the book of Galatians, Paul calls them Judaizers, of course, but he also suggests they are bewitchers. Galatians 3:1, disturbers, Galatians 5:10, insurrectionists, Galatians 5:12, vainglorious, Galatians 5:26, and a number of other unflattering quips. Paul ends up writing at least 13 letters to the saints known as the ecclesia, which is his body. And a common theme with them all is how to deal with the self-righteous knuckleheads who seem to have their headquarters in Jerusalem. I'm sorry, I almost said Rome. Their headquarters in Jerusalem, Galatians 2:9. Romans is no exception to this common theme. Yes, there are rich and deep themes in Romans, like justification for all and the righteousness of God being revealed through the faith that took Christ to the cross, Romans 3:21-31. But the self-righteous and the problems they cause seem to provide a nice sharp contrast to the work of God in the cross of Christ. Thus, we find ourselves in Romans 10:2-4. For I am testifying to them that they have a zeal of God, but not in accord with recognition, for they, being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own righteousness, were not subjected. They were not subjected to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the consummation of law for righteousness to everyone who is believing. Again, I'm not looking to discuss the problems with the Judaizers or the self-righteous, but to discover the achievements of the cross in Romans. And here, chapter 10, verses 2-4, we see that Paul is again bringing us back to the idea that the righteousness of God is not in the same league as that of human, religious, ethical-minded, self-righteous person. I need a "the" there. I do have it. The righteousness of God is not in the same league as that of the human, religious, ethical-minded, self-righteous person. In fact, Paul clearly says that somehow the law is toast for the believers. It is finished, it is unimportant, it is to be dismissed, and rather quickly. What is the righteousness? What is righteousness if it's not fawning all over the law? Now we're talking. Righteousness is, that is, the righteousness of God has everything to do with the cross and what was accomplished there. Again, see chapter 3, verses 21 through 31 for a more complete picture. The righteousness of God has to do with a concept taught by Paul that we call sin for sin. Sin for sin is taught in 2 Corinthians 5, 18 through 21. For the one not knowing sin, he makes to be a sin for our sakes, that we may be becoming God's righteousness in him. This teaching is very humbling. God makes Christ to be sin for our sakes. God does so that we might be becoming God's righteousness in him. All this takes place in the cross long before we were born, long before we thought of being good little boys and girls, long before we had one self-righteous idea. God makes Christ to be sin for our sakes long before we could even believe the matter. It was true long ago, long before we knew it was true. Christ in his work on the cross is the consummation of the law. Rejoice. Yes, God wants righteousness out of us, God wants righteousness out of us. And in order to get that righteousness out of us, God provides the very thing he wants. Remember, Paul says, what do you have that you did not receive? It's in 1 Corinthians 4:7. For who is making you discriminate? Discriminate, get it? The self-righteous tend to discriminate. You're evil. You're bad. I don't want to be around you. I'm going to kick you out of the fellowship. I'll be glad when you're gone and all the troublemakers gone. Those troublemakers who prattle on about grace. I can't stand that grace. Who is making you discriminate? Now, what have you which you did not obtain? Now, if you obtained it, why are you bragging, jackass? Why are you boasting as though not obtaining, like you invented it yourself? Bragger. So God is the source of all. Romans 11:36, Acts 17:25, etc. We all want to be accepted by God and accepted into the family of God, and we will. God is going to make sure of it. After all, there is only one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Ephesians 4:6. It was right of God to send Christ to the cross. Yeah, mind-blowing, right? The human mind cannot grasp its meaning and deep significance. It's not right to practice sin for sin, according to man's thinking. Two wrongs don't make a right, says any reasonable fellow. But in God's operation, he makes Christ to be sin for our sakes. That ain't right, we say. Put that in its proper quote marks. But it's what? Okay, so in God's operation, in God's operation, quote, he makes Christ to be sin for our sakes. That ain't right, we say, but it's what makes God right. The cross is the perfect display and manifestation of God's rightness. So we have to juggle between these two things. Number one, appreciation of the righteousness of God displayed in the cross of Christ. And number two, the attention seeking self righteous who want to parade their own rightness in front of our faces on a daily basis. So we have to juggle between those two things, the an appreciation of the righteousness of God and how to deal with the self righteous who dance in front of us all the time. Okay, so do the Judaizers ever mention the cross and anything it achieves? I've been around the block a time or two, and they are rather silent on the cross, but they won't stop talking about their own righteousness. Thank God for Paul and his revelation about God's Aeonian purpose. Ephesians 3:11. In my life, I've got some righteousness I could brag on, but looking back on it all, it weren't nothing. It was all silly and amounted to nothing to brag about at all. But when considering the cross and what it accomplished for us 2,000 years ago, before we were ever born, and certainly before we believed, holy smoke, I am humbled and grateful to God for counting me in. Don't let the self righteous Judaizers get you down. They talk a big game, but God is in the business of bringing us all to the end of ourselves so that He can eventually become all in us all. Grace to you, yours. P.S. I'm thinking that if you can see the righteousness of God in the cross of Christ, you'll actually be blinded to your own righteousness and you'll be more pleasant to be around. Thus, grace to you will mean something. The end. Okay.